So we are in the final week of our sermon series called God-Sized Faith, and we've been discovering passages all throughout the scripture of these people who've had extraordinary faith. Sometimes it almost sounds too good to be true, but when we look at their stories and we realize how human they were, they're people just like you and me, but they had this extraordinary faith about them that they were able to hold on to and keep through a lot of trying times. So the first week we talked about sometimes we've got to take the first step, right? To be able to see God do wonderful things and powerful things, to be able to see the miracle, sometimes it's up to us to take that first step. God is wanting us to do that. The second week then we talked about challenging ourselves to keep our eyes on Jesus rather than the circumstances. So rather than looking at the negatives and worrying about that and stressing about that, turning our eyes and keeping them on Jesus. Last week, we explored what it means to faithfully follow God wherever he leads us, even if the destination is unclear, even if we have absolutely no idea where he's going to take us, trusting him and allowing him to lead. So this week, we're going to look at how our faith can stay strong, even when it might cost us something. Now, if we want to see God's power in our lives, we must have a strong hold. We must keep our trust in God no matter what. Let me just say that again. If you want to see God do powerful things in your life, then we've got to keep our trust on him. We've got to be strong in that trust and let it up to him. Because when we believe strongly in something, we're willing to go, but we're also willing to give up the cost, whatever that might be. You know, it's almost similar, and this doesn't quite equal to comparing giving to God, but I think it's something we can all relate to. How many here have tried to get healthy from time to time? Make sure you're eating healthy, maybe exercise, doing something along those lines, right? I think all of us can kind of raise our hands. There's been somewhere in our life where we want to be healthy, we want to do it, but making the decision to actually start it can be really tough, right? Getting into the process, but then keeping the process going is just a whole nother battle of its own, right? And keeping that up and keep doing that. About 8 months ago, I was led to a program that was meant to heal my body of some things, particularly of migraines. And throughout this process, I realized that I could actually be completely healed from these migraines. I never thought that would be possible. I've been dealing with migraines for over almost 30 years now, believe it or not. I am that old, and I started when I was 15. So I'm 44 now, so almost 30 years. When I put those numbers together, I thought, wow, that's been a long time. And all I ever wanted to do was just get them under control, right? I have an opportunity right now, in the way things are going, to totally get rid of those migraines. And that is absolutely amazing, right? And so that's a huge incentive for me for sure. But I will tell you, it's not been easy over the last 8 months. I've had to give up an awful lot, and I've had to learn an awful lot. I've had to take a lot of time and study and learn, and I'm still learning. I'm still reading labels. I'm still discovering new things that I really shouldn't be eating. That's junk for all of us, not just me, but for anybody, right? And so learning and discovering takes a lot in itself, and it's been a long journey, and I will tell you there have been several times, where I have said, boy, I'd like to just walk away. I'd just like to walk away. And again, I have to remind myself of the incentive that I could completely get rid of these migraines. I'm happy just to get them under control. That's just a huge bonus if they completely get rid of it, right? And in many ways, it has benefited me, this whole program. I have healed in many avenues, and I have very little migraines. And the migraines that come, I can tell when and I can tell why, and it's all part of the detoxing process and things that's going on. And this is certainly not to boast in any sort of way, but I've gotten my weight under control in a huge way, even throughout all of this. So there's been a lot of healing, a lot of good things that come into it. But overall, I keep having to remind myself that I have to trust the process. When I want to walk away, when I want to give up, and when I say this is hard and I'm tired of doing this, I just want a piece of cake and some ice cream. You know, come on. I want to just eat like everybody else is eating. I want to be able to do this stuff. I don't want to have to find alternatives all the time. I have to just say no, just stop, because none of that stuff's important, and I have to trust the process. And to be honest with you, so far it's worth it. And so reminding myself to keep trusting it, which means I have to be dedicated to it. Right? I have to be dedicated to my health, but I have to be dedicated to the process and to the program and how it works. And you see, dedication is something that, whether it's a regimen of how we get healthy, or it's about our vibrant faith, making our faith so vibrant and so deep that we're connecting again with God, you can absolutely assume that it's going to come with a cost. There's going to be something that you have to give up, right? And sometimes it's things that are hard, but in the end we realize it's so worth it. So the question is whether we are willing to pay that cost, whether we're willing to go ahead and go with that. The Old Testament gives us a story of these three young men who faced an immense challenge to their faith in God, and not just on one occasion. They lived in this environment, but it began with a traumatic experience for the Hebrew people. It was back in 605 BC, so before Christ, 605 years before Christ came. The king was Nebuchadnezzar, and he was a king so strong and so dominating that everybody around him was scared of him. Everybody, okay? If he came to your country to take over your country, well, I'm sure most people just went, okay, take it, because there was no chance in the world that you were going to win. Like, that's how dominating he was and how powerful he was. Everybody feared him. And so just months after his reign started, he attacked the Jewish people of Judah. And to demonstrate his power and his dominance after victory, what he would do is he would take captive all of the young, handsome, wise, smart young men. He would take all the beautiful women, anybody he thought that would be of use to him, and he would take all these people into captivity. And what gets really weird and really strange, and we studied this a lot this past week in our Bible studies on Wednesday morning and evening, and I will tell you what gets really weird is how he manipulated the people. He put them in a 3-year training to readjust their brains to the culture they were now living in, okay? So they were to unlearn everything they knew already, learn all this new stuff. He changed everything about them, from the way they ate to the way they worshiped, all the way to their names. So they were like recreated to be whole new people that he wanted to be a part of his nation, to be a part of his kingdom, right? Sound familiar to some of our more recent history that we've had? Somebody compared him to Hitler, and I thought, wow, yeah, it was a lot of brainwashing and a lot of just trying to make up your own world and your own kingdom, right? So that's what this guy is doing. And in the Old Testament book of Daniel, it describes all of this, and it talks about how hard it was for these people to be living in this kind of captivity, and how King Nebuchadnezzar was exerting his power over all the nations around him, but especially over these Jewish exiles. So particularly in chapter 3, the story starts with King Nebuchadnezzar. He raised this massive gold statue. As I mentioned to the kids, it's 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, solid gold, right? So huge piece. It was this huge spectacle. And the king made everyone attend. He had everybody come around, and then he gave this command, and he made it very, very clear. He said, when you hear the sound of the instruments, the flute, the lyre, the pipe, whatever else, he names off all these other instruments, everyone in the whole nation, wherever you are, you hear this, you need to bow down right then and there. Don't wait. Don't put your stuff down. Don't do whatever else. You bow down right then and there. Again, this is a way that he's trying to exert his power onto the people. And he says, if you don't, your life will be put to death. You will be put in a blazing furnace and be killed. This is not just about religion at this point, right? This is well beyond just about religion. This was about an alliance to the king. It was about worship and dedication to someone other than the one true God. And as we hear in the Old Testament, God was called Yahweh was the name. And so he wants to get everybody onto his page, doing what he wants, worshiping him and his kingdom. The difficulty was that living in Babylon, this town where Nebuchadnezzar, this area where Nebuchadnezzar was the king, at that time there were many Jewish people who were exiled there, but they had their faith in Yahweh. It wasn't in this golden statue. It wasn't in anything that Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to put it into. But they were being forced to worship something else. Not only that, if they did not follow the commands given, it could cost them literally everything. Their lives, right? It wouldn't just cost them their stuff. It would literally cost them their life to remain faithful to God. Though we in this church are not necessarily even beginning to be forced to bow down to anything of that kind of idol. Not yet. We hope that won't come. We're going to work on that and do something about that, right? But we are being tempted to bow down on a daily basis to other gods. We have areas in our lives where, areas of our lives that receive our time, that receive our energy, receive our attention, our affection, and wherever the majority of our time is, wherever the majority of our lives are focused, that's where you can see what you're worshiping. If it's God, okay. But if it's something else, then maybe we need to re-examine that, because we all worship something. Every one of us, we all worship something. Within our culture, there is pressure to bow down to the god of travel baseball or travel soccer or whatever other child travel sport there is. and pressured to bow down to the God of the bank account, to the God of careers, the God of relationships, the God of social status, Instagram, Facebook, right? For those things to take our time and so much more. The expectation, though, is still the same. When these gods demand you bow, you do it. And why do you do it? You do it because your reputation's on the line, right? Your relationships might be on the line. Your positions might be on the line. Your comfort, your children's desires are all on the line. But in the end, one of the greatest idols we serve that keep us from true faith in God is the certainty and control. And I'll tell you this, one way I see this on a regular basis is people going to church and not going to church. And I tell you, if we just look to see where our priorities are, we'll see this real fast. But when I hear people coming to church and then not coming to church, and I see it in all the churches around, I hear all the other pastors around are seeing the same thing. It's like a cultural trend right now. I have to ask, where's your priority? Who are you putting first in your life? And then what we do is, see, we're so busy with so many things, and I'm guilty for this too. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody and putting any pressure on anybody. I'm guilty of this too. We get so busy in our lives, whether it's with our families, it's with our kids, it's with our career, it's with something, maybe it's even taking care of somebody else. If you got an aging parent, we get so busy in all of this stuff that we're someplace that we can cut things out. We're someplace that we can have a little bit of control, and we can say, I'm taking a break today. Sunday mornings, right? Because God's not right here pointing at you and pushing you to get to church. So we can go ahead and cut that out, and we can let go. But what happens when we start to do that? We start to let go of God in other ways too. In other ways. And before you know it, we're so distant from God that we don't even believe in him. We're not following him. We're not even close to him. And it starts on a slow, gradual thing. But you'll get there. And I don't know about you, but that's not where I want to be. It's not where I want to be at all. And I know you may think, well, you got to be here, Pastor. You're the pastor. Somebody has to bring the message. Well, you know what? I don't have to be a pastor. I have a choice. But I can tell you, if I wasn't a pastor, this is still where I'd want to be. I want to be in church every Sunday. I want to be able to worship God. I want to be able to honor him. But I also want the encouragement from everybody else. And I want the love that I can get from you, that I can only get from being around with my other Christian fellowship and friends. So I'm taking a little sidetrack here because I feel like if we are not worshiping God, we're so easily worshiping something else. So my words to you, my friends, are be cautious. Be cautious. Where you spend your time, notice what you're worshiping, and notice if it's God or if it's not. I recently read a story about a young man who was eager to grow in his Christian faith, and he took this piece of paper and he made this nice long list of all the things that he would do for God and all the things that he was going to eliminate from his life. So he was going to make sure that he didn't get distracted from God. And he made this list, and he went to church the next Sunday, and he put it on the altar. And when he put it on the altar, he thought this would make him feel joy, like this would bring him peace and make him feel good. But it just made him feel empty, and nothing happened. So he went home, and he wrote even more things down, made an even bigger list of things that he would do for God, things like the places he would go to minister, the areas he would minister in. And he was excited. He was on fire for God. So he kept writing and put more things that he would not do. He brought it back to church the next Sunday, put it on the altar, and again thought he'd find joy in doing that, and he still felt empty. So he has this old pastor friend, this wise old pastor, and he went and he told him the situation, and the pastor said to him, take a blank sheet of paper, blank, sign your name at the bottom of it, and put that on the altar. And the young man did it. He did it, and then he realized when he did it, he got it, and he knew what it meant, and he all of a sudden had this peace. The reason he had peace was because he quit trying to tell God what the to-do list is, what needed to be done. Instead, he left God lead the way and fill in the to-do list. And one of the greatest ways that we can commit to an unshakable faith is by giving God a blank sheet of paper, signing the bottom of it as a way of telling him that, yes, we will follow you. Even though we don't know where that's going to be, just like Abraham last week, we are willing to follow you and tell him that no matter what, we're letting you in the lead. I don't need that control. Faith in its simplest form is trust. That's what faith means, trust. In its simplest form, that's it. So back to Nebuchadnezzar here for a moment. The king made a decree that all would bow down when the music played. So as soon as they heard the harp, as soon as they heard any of the instruments playing, they were to all bow down to this massive idol. But there were 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down and worship such a God. No way, no way. And you know why? It's because they knew that the God that they worshiped was way greater, didn't even begin to compare to a statue, no matter how big it was, no matter how expensive it was. That did not even compare. So they were willing to say, no way, not happening. The God they worship could not and would not be superseded by any mere statue, no matter how big it was. Their alliance was with God and with God alone. So let's read here a little bit what happens in their story. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. I may just stop there for a moment because the king, he has a hot temper to begin with. If you read this whole story, you've already seen it a couple times by now. I mean, like, he's ready to rip your limbs off, limb by limb, if you don't do what he tells you to do, right? And so some of it, I'm sure, is just to show his power, but he's a pretty big hothead. And so he's in a rage now. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up?" Now take note here, because the reason he actually brings them in and gives them this opportunity to answer this question is for really one reason. These three men, as well as Daniel, who wrote this book, were put up into some high positions. The king liked them. He found a lot of favor in these guys. They were very wise. In fact, the scripture says that they were 10 times capable of doing what other guys in the royal service could not do, right? They had so much wisdom they could do it. So the king liked these guys. He didn't really want them to say no just for that reason alone. He said, "I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" He demanded that the three young men be thrown into the fire because they said no. That was their punishment. In reading this passage, you get this picture into this incredible faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have. Their response to the king, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but their response is just absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Did I skip a piece? Hold on one moment here. I don't want to miss this part of the story. I did, didn't I? Yes, let's get on to this here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, from your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." So they're saying, no, we're not doing it. It's not happening. So now their punishment is going to be thrown into this furnace. But what I love here about their statement is that they're like, we know our God is able, right? He's willing and he's able. If he wants to do it, he's going to save us. No big deal. But the key to the statement is that they say, but if he doesn't, it's still okay. It's still okay, because we will never stoop to that level and serve your gods. We've made this statement throughout this entire series that if we want to see God's power in our lives, that we have to be willing to step out, that we have to be willing to lay it all out on the line. We have to display this radical faith, that we have to be willing to count the cost following God, no matter what that is. Jesus actually spoke about this in the New Testament when he was clarifying what it means to be a disciple. He says, the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things. He will be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but on the third day, he will be raised from the dead. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but are yourself lost and destroyed? So Jesus began by showing that he himself was willing to lay it all on the line, right? That he was willing to take those steps. He was willing to give up everything that it would cost him to be faithful to God's will and to God's ways. He was rejected and he was ultimately killed for his commitment to the kingdom of God. Truthfully, again, this isn't necessarily to scare you, but maybe some of that good fear needs to be put into us, is this is exactly what's going to happen to us. When we commit to God, we're going to have to sacrifice. We're going to have to give up something. It's going to cost us. We may not ever be faced with losing our lives, but I want you to know that there are Christians all around the world every single day who are being martyred for their faith, who are dying for believing in Jesus Christ. In fact, statistics show that every year there are more people, more Christians being martyred than there was in the early church years, right? That's today. It's real and it's happening here. To Jesus, true faith means to be willing to take up your cross daily and follow him no matter what. In fact, it's in losing our lives for his sake that he says we actually save our lives, right? We actually save our lives. There was an author, Joseph Stonewall. He wrote the book called Through the Fire, and he talks about this missionary in there named David Livingstone, and he says this: I think of David Livingstone, the pioneer missionary to Africa, who walked over 29,000 miles. Can you imagine? Sandy, you keep track of your miles daily, weekly. That's a lot of miles, isn't it? His wife died early in their ministry, and he faced stiff opposition from his Scottish brethren. He ministered half blind. That's impressive. His kind of perseverance spurs me on. As I run, I remember the words in his diary. Send me away. I think I put it up here for you. Send me away only to go with me. Lay any burden on me, only sustain me. Sever me from any tie, but the tie that binds me to your service and to your heart. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they got this. They understood that concept, right? And that's exactly what they did. They had the same heartbeat here as Livingstone, and their faith came at a cost. So they get thrown into this furnace. But something you should know is that this furnace was increased to be 7 times hotter than it normally was. That's pretty hot. In fact, the guys who binded them up, who tied them up to throw them into the furnace, actually died from the heat of the furnace just throwing them in. They got burnt up themselves. That's how hot this thing was. So Daniel goes on here and he says, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego surely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Well, look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. A god. Wow. So 3 men went in, but now there's 4 in there. They went in tied up, but now they're walking around. And scholars aren't exactly sure who that 4th guy is. You know, was this God in flesh? Was this a pre-incarnated Jesus, an image of Jesus? Was this an angel? Doesn't matter. What we do know is that God sent a heavenly visitor to save those guys and to be with them in that fire. The interesting thing here to notice is that God did not keep the guys from going into the fire. Right? He didn't save them before they got thrown into the furnace, but he did go in with them, and he saved them there. Right? He did go in with them. I have had a heartbreaking privilege, I guess is the best way to describe it, of walking through many times, hard times with church members over and over and over again. Sometimes it's the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's just having questions and trying to find answers. Sometimes it's they want to remain faithful, but they're just ready to give up because things are so hard. But what I get to witness over and over and over again is that when someone finds the courage to lean on their trust in Jesus, they all of a sudden realize that they're not alone. They're not in it alone. That the presence of God is with them in this heavy trial. And I've had moments in my own life that have been very heavy and very crushing, like weight crushing. And at the same time, I can't explain it, but when I get in there, I know, I have this sense that I'm not alone. I'm not alone, that there's somebody there with me, and that it's the presence of God. And our greatest time of need is usually when we find that we're not alone. We say it often, God is with us, God will take care of you, he's always with you. But a lot of times it's not until we are hit so hard with these heavy times that we actually believe it, and we actually realize that, hey, I'm not alone, I'm not. And demonstrated for us throughout the scriptures is a God who is willing to go to great lengths to rescue his people, amen? I mean, that's huge. We have a God who loves us so much, has such a deep, passionate love for us that he is willing to go into the fire with us. You know, I think it's one thing if he wants to save us from going into the fire, but it's a whole nother thing that he's willing to go in it with us. I mean, just think about that. That's huge love. In fact, the name given to Jesus at his birth was Emmanuel. Do you know what Emmanuel means? God with us. God with us. That's his name. That means permanently. God with us. There may be someone here who needs to hear that this morning. You are not alone. Jesus hasn't forgot about you. No, he is still with you. He is in the fire with you right now. Now, what if our courage to hold on to our faith in this manner could have the same impact that those 3 Jewish boys had, or that it had in their lives? And their story ends, let me just read this to you because I can't explain it as well as we can just read it. But Daniel ends it by saying that Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God," he recognizes, "come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothes were not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke, right? Amazing, amazing. The word Nebuchadnezzar used here is a very specific word for God. And the word is actually, it's the Most High God, but the word that he uses is El Elyon, okay? So he is right away announcing this God, your God, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, your God, he's the Most High God. You got to remember, Nebuchadnezzar had a ton of gods. He had a long list of them, but he's saying, nope, yours is at the top. And through this, and what you start to see throughout his story, is that he does do a 180, and he turns his whole life over to the one true God. If we want to see that kind of power that can take a guy who is so powerful, who is so dominating here on earth, if we want to see that kind of power where God can turn him around into a 180 and change him and recognize that he's not a God at all, and there is only one true God, that's amazing power. If we want to see that, then that kind of power, we've got to step out. We've got to put our toes in the water, right? We've got to go ahead and take the step, and we've got to stay true to God no matter what it costs. No matter what it costs.